Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the HE.SHE.THEY podcast. I'm Sophia Kearney, co-founder of HE.SHE.THEY, and very excited to kick this podcast series off today. For those of you who aren't already familiar with HE.SHE.THEY, we originate from England, but operate globally as an events brand, fashion house, record label, social app, and multiple other facets to come, I'm sure. The overarching ethos of our brand is to create brave spaces for intersectionality across electronic music, fashion, and culture. To hear our origin story in detail, check out our RA Exchange podcast in the show notes. A podcast is an element of HE.SHE.THEY that Stephen Brains, my long-suffering business partner, and I wanted to incorporate for a long time. We're lucky enough to meet a vast range of incredible people through our roles both as music managers and CEOs of the HE.SHE.THEY brand. We wanted to shine a spotlight on some of the amazing individuals, art, conversations, modalities and ideas that cross our paths. We hope that our audience will find new insights to people or topics you're aware of, and maybe a little light-hearted education on those you don't. So without further waffle, I'm going to introduce today's guest and conversation, the ever-inspiring Amy Jandrisevits. Amy and HE.SHE.THEY have a similar ethos in the sense we believe representation is essential for societal growth, cultural change, and most of all, that individuality should be celebrated. Amy runs a non-profit organisation called A Doll Like Me, where she custom makes her own handmade dolls for children so that they can see themselves in the toys they play with. She's brought joy and comfort to so many children and their families when love, empathy, and little daily reasons to smile were of the utmost importance. Please enjoy this conversation with the incredible Amy Jandrisevits.
On the lovely HE.SHE.THEY podcast, Sophia and I are joined by someone that I think is genuinely an angel amongst us normal humans on earth. Is the lovely Amy from A Doll Like Me. It's one of the charities that we support at HE.SHE.THEY. So, hello, Amy.
Thank you. It's nice to finally meet in person, right?
Because
after all this time.
Has he been hounding you with Instagram DMs and all sorts? Yes, I know that behaviour.
Yeah.
It must be about 2 years ago or something like that.
But yeah.
And I was just like, this is genuinely amazing. And then just from there, like my birthday fundraisers on Facebook are always for A Doll Like Me. But just before we get too far on that, Amy, do you just want to explain what it is that makes you celestial?
Oh, man, I should have you in my pocket all the time. Boy, let me get my kids up here. Say it again. Let me get all three of them in here, and then say it. So I always say that in a nutshell, I make dolls for kids who don't see themselves on the store shelves. I think that the doll making, which in a really crazy twist has become kind of an advocacy role. I imagine that you guys, that resonates with you because I think that
100%.
We live very parallel lives in different arenas, right? And I think that what we both truly believe is the power of inclusion and representation, right? You do adults, I do kids. Our spheres are parallel but different. And so I think there's real power in, especially when you're young, in seeing yourself in the face of a doll. And it's something that so many of us take for granted, that I could take my little girl to, the toy store, and she's blonde and blue-eyed, and she could see herself everywhere. So my youngest is 5, and when she turned 3, we showed her Cinderella for the first time. And the first thing she said, and mind you, my husband and I are feminists. We don't gender stereotype our kids. And literally the first words out of her mouth were, "I wish I had blonde hair and blue eyes." And the crazy part of it is that she does. That's what's really weird. And it's funny because she sees, her whole life has been these dolls. And so for her at such a young age to have already realized that we have some type of standard for how you should look, we absolutely don't, probably we unconsciously do, but we don't consciously push that on our kids. And so you think of the millions of kids around the world who think the same thing, but don't look like that. And I think that that's where we're so parallel, in that then they grow up And that's where you guys come in, because I think that a lack of inclusivity and representation in childhood plays out in adulthood when you don't fit the standard model of what we think you should.
Like you say, the body positivity thing is a big thing. I mean, I would never, until seeing your charity, this is the privilege of play, thought, oh yeah, limb difference dolls, because every beauty standard or every standard of inverted commas normal doesn't include them. They're not represented. And that must be so isolating. And having to play with something that doesn't look like you, kind of almost play and the doll, even if you're just on your own, you're already othered by the doll.
Yeah, and that's so it's such a funny thing, because I think there's this photographer that I follow, and he photographs endangered species. And it's such a random connection, but I remember we were watching a video, and one of the things he said is, the reason I do this is because you have to look into the face of these animals, because you won't save what you don't love. And I think about that with the dolls, that again, you won't save what you don't love, right? And so you have to look into the face of these kids and realize what this means to them. There was a video that I shared this morning of a little girl. Actually, she's not even that little. I mean, she was about 13 or 14 when she got the doll, and she has a hand difference. And the first place her eyes go, I mean, and you watch it unfold. I mean, it's a matter of seconds, right? But you watch it unfold. She looks at the doll's hand and she immediately cries. And it's so powerful because it's the first time she's seen herself, right? And there's this kind of this validation, I think, that we can't really put a finger on. We talk about how it matters, but until you see a video like that, it's hard to even explain that to someone.
It took, because I mean, you've really got to be dead inside to not see that video and just
right?
So emotional.
It's joy. It's an overwhelming.
I love the way she went to visit her mum as well, because came across that she'd experienced a lot of support from her mum and that they had this closeness. That came through in the video, and for her to then, after having the moment herself, then go to want to share that with her mother, that really then was very emotional.
And this whole video is what, I don't even know if it's more than 30 seconds, and it's this snapshot of, I couldn't explain it better about why this matters for kids. It's just that is really a perfect video, because, and then she's old enough to be able to understand what the power of that is. There's a video that I have of a little guy, and he's actually playing with a doll who has a hand like him, and then a doll that has 10 fingers. And the doll with 10 fingers says to the doll that looks like him, I mean, and he's like 2 years old, mind you. And this is what play therapy looks like. So he says to the doll with the hand difference, I like your hand, guy. And it's such a simple interaction, but it's a real, like when you talk about what self-acceptance looks like, he's only 2 years old and he's able to figure out this is okay, right? And, there's so many videos like that. It's amazing. And it's so hard to explain to someone who can go to the store. Mm-hmm. My little girl sees herself everywhere, right? I always say, who we see and how we see them makes a huge difference.
One of the things that struck me was, again, on one of your interviews, is when the kids got the doll, the comments that people post about the kid and the comments that they have in real life changes. Do you want to talk about that?
So that Hope, the little girl in that video I posted today is named Hope. And that video, when we first saw it, it was like, this is crazy. That was when I first started doing dolls for kids with limb differences, and it kind of went viral. And so her local news station did a story on that, the doll and the video, and the narrative wasn't Hope, the girl with the arm. The narrative was Hope, the girl who had the doll that looked like her. And you think about this is funny, because when I have done interviews, particularly with very young journalists, then I'll say, what do you want the narrative to read? Because really the story is not Amy who makes dolls at her dining room table. right? That's not really the story. The story is, for the first time in these kids' lives, they're able to look at something human and see themselves. And that's a wildly different narrative, right? And so for Hope, the story was the girl with the doll, not the girl with the arm. And that reads so differently, you know? And that happens, you know, time and time again with some of these kids. There's a little guy who has nevus. And I'm sure you've seen his picture. He's adorable. And he's got spots all over. I mean, he could not be any cuter. And the story when he has his doll is, oh my gosh, that little boy's doll matches him, not what's wrong with your kid, right? And that reads so differently.
And it's so important for the kids as well, because like, not only do they have to look at other kids and feel that they are different and have to come to terms with that on their own terms, but having other people and other adults pushing their own uncomfortableness and opinions on such young children. Like, we have the first 7 years of our lives, from some studies that I've read, are so formative in terms of what we internalize and what our self-esteem, and what negative things we hear and what we take on, and how it actually shapes our personality. And so anything to turn all of that narrative into a positive thing is so beautiful. And there's so many positive repercussions from that further in their lives that, like, we can't even actually measure or truly understand, but it's just so beautiful, honestly.
It's amazing, first of all, to be able to do this. Number one, because I loved dolls. And so to know that I grew up and I could still play dolls is like a dream come true. But to be able to, and I think that you're put in positions, and I tell my boys this a lot, you'll be put in a position where you have the ability to advocate for someone else. What are you going to do when you have that opportunity? And this is funny because oh gosh, it's been about 2 years ago. Our local paper in Milwaukee ran an article, and the headline was, "Woman Makes Dolls for Girls Suffering from Self-Esteem Issues." And I was like, okay, first of all, that's so wild. First of all, that's not true. Number one, because we put that on these kids. It was so, I was so stunned, and I called the editor and I said, you can't run that. That's just not true. And he laughed and he said, well, what do you want it to say? You know, and that's when I wrote, like, that's one of those moments where you realize I've been put in a position of advocacy. What am I going to do? The story could simply just be, yeah, this mom sits at her dining room table. We haven't eaten there in 3 years or whatever, but nobody cares. And I said, well, what do you want the story to be? And I said, and he's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, is it for the first time in these kids' lives, they're being represented? Or is it the mom? And he said, well, we want the mom story. And I said, well, that's too bad, because you have a chance to change the narrative in a very literal way, right? Your words, that title, changes the narrative completely. And so I always tell people, like, write the story like it's going to go viral, because what if it does? What do you want the lasting impression to be for these kids? Like, if you've got one bullet in the chamber, is that the lasting impression that you want? You know, you have the potential to really change the course for some of these kids. What are you going to do with it? And I think about that conversation a lot, because I think that this has turned into an opportunity for advocacy. In fact, Love What Matters is going to air that video today, or sometime. They asked for permission to use it. And I think about the reach in something like that, and how you can look at it and say, gosh, I never really thought about that. That is a pretty big deal, you know? So, I mean, tell the story like it's going to change someone's life, because it very well could. When I was doing my research yesterday, then I learned, one of the things that you said was, who do you see in the DJ, right? In the DJ world, who do you see? You see white men, right? And one of the stories that you talked about was a movie about a woman who wanted to become a DJ, remember?
Beat Girl.
What you said was so funny, because it's so true, because the story was some guy, or she was impressing a guy or something.
Yeah, she learned to be a DJ because she wants to woo this man, not because she wants to have a talent herself. It's like, no, the whole narrative is like, how do I get male approval?
Yeah. So like, ironically, the story is still about that. And I think about that with these kids. Like, think about mainstream media. When you see some of these kids, the movie is about the kid with the blank, the kid with the limb difference, the kid with the wheelchair, the kid. It's not simply, the kid. It's always, we have to add that,
You would never write that the kid with the able body. The kid who can,
yeah.
It's always the difference, and it is othering. And talking about media and stuff, I mean, nearly every baddie in Disney and Roald Dahl's remake of The Witches recently is that the baddies or the villains are normally the ones that have some kind of limb difference, or you're planting the seed in people who haven't got limb differences' minds. Be scared of the person with the scar, or the difference it means that they're somehow evil. And then you're completely stigmatizing the other person's own self-worth, being like, oh, so I'm nasty or malign or bad inherently.
I think like you said in one of your articles, Amy, like there's just so many people where if you don't have this, if you don't have someone in your life with a limb difference or in a wheelchair, then the thought process just isn't there as much. And
think about that for anything, for racism, for sexism. If it doesn't affect you, I don't have to think about it, right? I don't have to worry about it, because and that's funny, because so out of the, there's been a lot of articles written about the dolls and what that means, and out of the million that there's a piece done with CBS Evening News, and it was seen over 10 million times. And so I think of like the millions of places these have been, the handful of, and I read all the comments. Somebody was like, whatever you do, this one journalist came in, she flew in from New York, and she's like, whatever you do, don't read the comments. And what do? I always read the comments, because I think you need to know what people are saying. How do you adjust your message in a better way, right? Like if people are criticizing, whatever it is. And really the main criticism is, and this is such a funny, apply it to anything. I grew up without this and I turned out just fine, right? Apply that to, learning about LGBTQ issues, learn that about race, about whatever it is. Well, I turned out just fine. And that's always the fallback, right? You didn't think about it because you didn't have to, right? And if we truly, I think that when you look at the hashtags, representation and inclusion, it's not, remember, you guys are way younger than I am, but during the AIDS crisis, remember they would wear, in the Oscars, they would wear the AIDS pin. And you think at some point, do you even know why you're doing that? Right? And so we talk a lot about inclusion and representation. What does that mean? Like genuinely, yeah, we include it, but what are we doing about it? And that applies to what you do as well, right? That we say we're an inclusive society. Not America, but other countries, we say we're in
the UK is like a microcosm of America half the time.
Well, I think you're in a different place. I think that we are experiencing, look at what our legislation is. We're experiencing quite a backlash for people, particularly trans people, right? That
same in England. Our equalities minister is a woman who essentially is a transphobe, right, Sophia?
Yeah, correct.
It's the equality minister who's trying to roll back the legislation, the Gender Recognition Act, which we have in the UK, where you can go. Actually, Sophia, do you want to say it? Because I'll waffle too much.
Well, it's just that during the cloak of the pandemic, they're just trying to sort of sweep all these bills through and all these legislation through to the point of saying that, different things on the census and different bathrooms that you can or can't use, and people being really offended by these things. And all the whilst this is going on, there's still so much violence towards trans people, which is then not getting properly looked at. And then there's these very difficult, and we know that there's a lot of frustrations in the trans community here as well, with the way things are and with the government. There's been a lot of people resigning who were the good advocates in government for LGBT and women's rights as well. And it's just, We've just got a very conservative government at the moment over here, and it's not the one. It's not the one.
Yeah, it's it's fun. That's where I think we're so parallel, in that who you see and how you see them makes a world of difference, right? And how you're portraying some of these issues, and that speaks to pretty much anything in these kids that I see. I mean, initially this started as a doll for a little girl who had her leg amputated. And then you realize there's this whole world of kids who don't see themselves, right? They don't look like what you see on the shelves. Let's see, how old Barbie is, 75? Is that right? Roughly. It took them 75 years to come up with a doll that had a limb difference. How long have there been people with limb differences? Since the beginning of time. I mean, and while I'm proud that they've made the steps in a market that is so central to a child, how come we haven't caught up yet? We're shaping, and then again, when we talk about representation and inclusion, it tends to just kind of be I'm going to wear my AIDS ribbon and support. Well, what does that mean? What are you doing to ensure that really happens? And like I said, that the toy market is really powerful. That American Girl doll, and I love American Girl doll. That's a huge deal here. And it was such a big deal that I think it was the doll last year had a hearing aid. And you think, yeah, that's a great step, but that's really not that big a deal, right? We played with dolls for hundreds of years, thousands, and a doll with a hearing aid is not a big deal. But it was, because we've never seen that in the toy market.
Because as well as limb difference, you have people who have albinism, who have vitiligo in different skin conditions and things like that, which there's just nothing about inclusivity until you were doing it. You really changed the entire game and landscape in that. It is mad. Out of the billions of people, nobody else did that until you did that.
Yeah, that's just crazy. That, to me, that's crazy too. And you still look at, the impact that it has for some of these kids. And I don't just say, there are other dolls too. So it's not just mine that are making a difference. I just happen to know mine. And I see what a game changer it can be for some of these kids, because it's such a mixed message of, yeah, we think you're beautiful. We totally believe in inclusion. But we're never going to have a toy that looks like you, unfortunately. And that's such a mixed message for a kid, having something that looks like you. And I remember there was a boy I did a doll for very early on, and he was probably about 15, and his mom wanted it because he said the only toy he would see of himself was in something mutant. And he had 3 fingers, and I think the Mutant Ninja Turtles do as well. What does that do? What a heavy weight we put on kids to have to carry something like that, right?
Yeah.
That's so tough. So it's certainly been this eye-opening journey for me. I mean, I never intended on running a business. I certainly never intended on having a nonprofit, but I think that things just kind of unfolded, and I've happened to have had this platform where I can talk about why this makes a difference.
Well, you were always, just for anyone who doesn't know, you've always kind of been in those caring professions, and you worked as an oncology nurse, correct? Was it
a social worker? Yep.
Was it pediatrics, or was it?
Yep. I worked in pediatric oncology, and I mean, that was how many years ago? That was a long time ago, 24 years ago. And when you look at a child with cancer, particularly a child of color with cancer, right? The only dolls at that time that I found were Cabbage Patch dolls. And I was lucky if I could find an African-American Cabbage Patch doll for some of these kids, because that was the only dolls that I could think of that were bald. But you can't very well put, a princess doll with long blonde hair in the lap of a boy of color and say, okay, we got to pretend that this is you. And this is what they're going to do when you go in for this procedure. And we ask kids to do that all the time. And so even back then, I just thought this is such a bizarre mismatch of what's available and what these kids actually look like. And so quite a few of my dolls lately, it tends to kind of go in waves because I think that some of these groups are very small. So Chinese without albinism, right? I mean, that's a really small group of people. And I remember very early on, this mom emailed me and said, I realize this is a total long shot, but do you think you could make a doll with, Chinese features, but white hair and blue eyes? And I thought, gosh, that's such that's such an easy request. And I did my research in terms of what is out there. And you look at the way people depict some of these kids, and like as a parent, it would make me sick. And I would hate to show my child, this is how people see you. They would have just really horrifying ways of representing these kids. It just was awful. And so then that's a subset of people who talk. And so then I'll get a bunch of orders like that. But anyways, recently it seems to be kids with cancer. And that's a hard thing to find, particularly if you have, you've had brain surgery and you have scars running down your head or whatever it is. So it's so fascinating. Like every day, I mean, I'd be lying if I said I didn't marvel at the fact that I get to do this. And I think that when it isn't still special, it's probably time to quit. But, you hear these stories, and I feel somehow like this desperation in parents, is this something you could do? And I think that, unfortunately, the other criticism that I hear is that it takes a long time to get a doll. And it is just me. I don't want to run, and everybody's like, well, you should hire people. But this was never intended to be a factory. This is intended to be somebody's telling you their very personal story. These kids are not check the box. This is not a check the box if you want the right hand or the left hand. Check the box if you want, whatever it is.
Yeah.
These are actual people who really have some raw stories. And I never want to lose that intimacy with these families. So this will never be a factory. I mean, for goodness sakes, I'm doing this at my dining room table. Sometimes my kitchen counter. It's not that type of thing. So it does take a long time.
It's an emotional connection, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah, of course.
Totally. And I think that's probably, like, I think about which piece of these criticisms that I want to own. That's definitely something that I have to own. It is so personal. I mean, it's the reason why I did social work in the first place, was because I think it's so important to connect with people.
Yeah.
And particularly people, not because I can fix it, but because I can be a part of the journey. I mean, and it sounds so corny and cheesy, but I really do think about each kid when this doll is sitting on my table or my counter. And, my kids will say, what difference does this doll have? And it becomes a very personal, it's kind of like art, if you will. You create something that has a lot of feeling behind it. And I don't want to supervise people. I mean, if somebody else decides to do this, more power to them. I don't want to be a supervisor. And I don't want to micromanage other people, because I do this because I genuinely, selfishly, I get a lot out of doing it too. So it is a very personal process. I mean, I remember I did a talk to a group of kids, and this very little girl said, what's the hardest doll you've ever had to make? And I was like, what a great question. And I said, in a very child way, the ones that tend to be the most difficult aren't difficult for skill level, but because of your heart, what this child is going through, or that I'm rushing through one because I know that in, 2 months, this child won't be alive anymore. That's the very raw, touching part of this. And I'm not sure how that translates into manufacturing. A doll that I posted the other day, and she died a few months ago, and her parents have the doll sitting on their bed. It's a very surreal feeling for me to know that doll is a representation of what they have of this little girl. There's one that I did of a little girl, and she had multiple facial anomalies. And in fact, she was the reason why social media had to put bullying, physical differences as part of their bullying. I mean, if you can believe that adults are so nasty.
It's so horrible. There's a woman we follow who's a blogger. I think she's amazing because she's just, just going to post and be me regardless. Somebody wrote, like, you're too ugly to be allowed to post selfies. Like how can you, like, do that and then, like, go make yourself a cup of coffee? And, like, just not think that you're an utter piece of shit for writing that.
I think they're so ignorant and so unempathetic that they can't even make the connection between what they're saying and how it could possibly make someone else feel. All they're doing is they have been very badly hurt, and there's a lot of unresolved trauma or anger inside of them, and the only way that they can express that is to pass it on. But yeah, I don't.
Welcome to American politics. Oh, it would absolutely crush me as a parent to hear somebody say that about my child. And so this particular doll, I remember her mom reached out and said, could you do this? And I was like, oh my gosh. I said, I feel so much pressure. It's going to look like her. It's not her, just so you know. And she was like, I just appreciate if you would try. Legitimately, that doll was the longest it has ever taken me to make a doll, because it was so just personally difficult. And she died, gosh, it's well over a year ago. They take the doll on vacation. She has 2 other kids, and they change who gets to sleep with the doll. They just did a story a few weeks ago, and there's a family picture of them on the beach, and this doll is there also. And that's when people say it's not, it's just a doll. And it really isn't.
It's really not, no.
You have gone so long without feeling that validation, either as a child or as a parent. It's not, and it doesn't have to be just mine. And I'm not saying
we're all crying now, by the way, audio description. Sophia and I are both away.
So that's okay. When we go back to that photographer, right? When he talked about you don't save what you don't love, right? That's what I'm talking about. And I think you have to look at these kids. You got to hear these stories. Like my family hears all the time, you guys have to hear this story. This is really amazing. Or this is a really amazing doll because, and I feel that everybody should know that because it's a total paradigm shift, right? The narrative is quite different when you hear what's behind some of these dolls. And that doll for Sophia was just, it's still, and I'm still very close to her mom, and I see this doll appear in different places or at Christmas dinner or whatever it is. And you realize this is a representation of that child. That's why this is so important. Not only mine, but it really is. It's a very just surreal feeling. It's quite remarkable. I mean, there's no other way to say it.
I think it's just beautiful for the family to allow. Obviously, they can still talk about Sophia as often as they want, and she could be just as present with or without the doll that they can create. But just to have something physical, as you say, about getting turns to cuddle and it being a tactile thing and it being, inside the photographs and everything. It takes memories and remembrance and honouring a person's spirit to just such another level, and especially when there are other children involved as well, who then the doll that has then been the play therapy doll for their sibling who's so sadly no longer there now becomes part of a whole family therapy for all of them to bond and just still be with her in real time. It's just there are no words for it, really. It's just very special.
There really is something to, I mean, a doll is such an old-fashioned concept, isn't it? I mean, and a cloth doll, but there's something about touch, like you said, there's something about being able to hold something. In fact, there's another little girl who, and this one, I just couldn't stop thinking about her. I knew when I made her doll that she was on borrowed time, and once she got it, she only lived a few weeks. And the doll was in the mom's wedding. Like how, I mean, when you talk about the power And again, please don't think I'm saying it's all about my dolls. It's not.
No, we know you're not. There's such a huge piece of you in every one of these dolls and in this experience that you create for people. Like it's part of you, and we're honoured to hear your story right now.
Like I feel connected to these dolls, so let alone the person who actually made it or the family of the fact that you used the word selfish to describe yourself at one point.
I was like, thinking, my goodness,
if you're selfish, I don't know what the hell I am.
No, I get, you know, and I sometimes feel like I get so much out of this personally, and I think that it's something I have to keep in check too. It does. I mean, some of these kids just totally grab your heart. It just is, it's impossible not to. And so I have to make sure that what I'm doing still maintains a piece of advocacy, or that I'm doing this for the right reasons and not just, gosh, this makes me feel really good to have helped somebody, but more, I have a skill set. And I say this because, and I think that this is such an important thing. I believe we all have a skill set that we bring to the table. Doesn't, for you in this moment, your gift you bring to the table is storytelling. I think that you fell into advocacy in probably an unexpected way, like I did.
We were just sick of not being represented anyway. We were just like with our big artist who's queer, mixed race woman who's amazing, brought all the Glacians there ever were, Maya Jane Coles. I was in the room as the only queer person other than Maya, or Sophia was there as the only woman who was there apart from Maya. And sometimes it was like the three of us just being in these rooms full of cis straight white men who were not against. It was just like, how is the dance music scene come from its origins of being people of colour and about unity and community and queer culture to this? When I first went out 20 years ago, it was more diverse than it is now. So how does it regress?
I'm not a big like fate type person, but on some level, you cast your fate to the wind, right? And you decided, your heart was in the place where you knew this needed to happen. In fact, this was a great talking point for me and my 16-year-old about, now these kids grow up. What does it look like when you grow up and you don't fit this standard way that we think you should? What is it? How validating is it for people to know? I mean, thinking that your tagline in one of the things that I read was like a come as you are.
Like why we wanted to create representations of our dancers have got different body shapes and sizes. So we just want to represent all these different types of people, so that if you're on the dance floor looking up, you can always see someone who looks like you. Or it's okay if I've got lumps and bumps and I'm not this like size 0 model kind of build. It's like,
yeah. So I have to tell you though, that was a really interesting, because my 16-year-old Elijah was sitting with me when I was reading yesterday, and it was great. You know, we've always told our kids that sexuality, gender identity is a continuum. And so this was a good opportunity to revisit that it's all a continuum, because I don't want to ever have one of those conversations where my kids have to be stressing out when they tell me, hey mom, this is how I identify, or whatever it is. I don't want to have one of those Facebook moment conversations. It just is, because we've always said it doesn't, there's this continuum. But it was a great opportunity to talk to him about what you promote in these clubs. And that's I think that you have so much untapped potential. And again, what I was saying is that we have so much in common in different worlds. Inclusion and representation is, boy, that's everything. I mean, ask any therapist why they're seeing people, and majority would be that's at the heart of it, right? I don't feel included or accepted. I don't feel that, yeah. And I'm doing the same thing. It's the same situation. I feel as though you are a little bit ahead of your time. I mean, hopefully this interview you did, in 2019, you were like, I think that this is a conversation we really shouldn't be having, and hopefully in the future we aren't. Unfortunately, maybe we even more so are now.
It's funny when you start talking about diversity and inclusion, they're like, oh, you mean, so like, there's going to be like a mixture of like queer people. Like, yeah, but not just queer people, like also like women and trans people. Like, oh, okay. And like, okay, and there should be black teachers as well. But yeah, but also Asian DJs, Turkish DJs, Arabic DJs, like, because I think sometimes even those conversations can become like this weird binary dichotomous relationship. Like everyone else in between those kind of points gets omitted from the discussion. So we've been trying to do that and educate people, and often as well in the queer scene, like, oh, what do you mean it needs to be more diverse, right? We're a marginalized community. It's like, it's not that much diverse about 3 cis white men DJing who happen to be gay in a club.
Yeah.
So if you're like a trans woman of color, where's your representation in this queer space? It's so odd, that thing of marginalized communities trying to marginalize other communities within them.
Yeah, I don't understand the whole TERF thing. I don't understand how anyone could feel. Again, it can't, what I was saying earlier about people not putting themselves in other people's shoes with empathy, and it's about their own experience. Like that, a trans woman coming into a women's bathroom, if a woman feels really uncomfortable with that, like this trans woman just wants to use the bathroom in a place where they're not going to feel like there's a chance they might get beaten up, there's a chance that someone might say something to them, that they feel unsafe. And I have never felt unsafe in any bathroom where trans people were present or anything like that. And I feel like a lot of these women are maybe not very connected with themselves, and a lot of their own fear of perhaps something they've experienced as oppression from men possibly before, or some sort of lived experience they've had in their life, which is obviously not great, but it's not this person's fault that's now just trying to live their life. Like, they haven't done anything to you. They've gone in a toilet cubicle and they've come out and they've washed their hands and they've left. Like,
Right.
It's the same mentality that you've had with those people going, well, why do they need a doll? I've been fine.
yeah.
Like,
How many dolls have you made, Amy, in total?
Oh man, let's see. I've easily made, well over 400, I'm sure.
jeez.
And probably closer to 500. During quarantine, I'm not gonna lie, it's been a little hard. My kids are doing virtual school still.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not gonna lie, that's a little bit hard to manage school here and so, but
You are one person,
right.
so much, and take on so much emotionally as well. Like,
well, this was what I wanted to say. How do you take, because I know you just said so wonderfully earlier that you almost feel selfish because you take so much joy from this, and whilst that's like just one of the most incredible things I've ever heard, I felt so much emotion from us just even having this conversation. So to be putting so much of yourself and everything into these dolls and physically making them, like, how do you take care of yourself? And would you have any advice for anyone who's like running a non-profit or doing an advocacy for something, or feels like they're an activist in whatever way?
The short answer, no. I'm gonna let you know. I'm gonna get back to you. I'll let you know when I actually do those things. No, and that's a great question. And I think, do as I say, not as I do, right? I think that the reason I went into social work was because I feel that empathy happens to be one of my strengths. And it's also your greatest asset is your greatest liability. I don't know. I have not mastered that. I'm not gonna lie.
That's so true.
These families are letting you into a real intimate part of their lives. I mean, these are some really heavy stories. I mean, once I finish their doll, typically people will friend me on social media. And so I do follow them, for better or for worse. And again, this is why this is so different. This is a terrible business model. Like, business 101, don't do this, right? I would never collect payment. If you can, pay. If you don't, then you don't. And it wasn't until becoming a nonprofit that I was like, all right, I have to have the money to cover some of these costs.
Because people can and should donate to you.
A Doll Like Me became a nonprofit organization 2 years ago. 2 years, now in April, it's been 2 years. And the reason being, I felt it was so, again, I am not a business person. And I felt so awkward saying, thanks for telling me your life story. That's great. The doll's going to cost you $100. Like, it just felt so wrong. And I was like operating in the red because I thought, I cannot do it to these people. Look, I know you're about to lose your child. Here's the bill. I just was like, I can't do it. And, fortunately I have a husband. My husband is a child psychologist, and he gets the importance of this too. So it never was like, you're not bringing in the money we're putting into this. It was never like that. But I thought I need a way to pay for some of this stuff.
To do the right thing isn't cheap.
Yes, and that's so funny. That's so true. I think when you genuinely, and this is, I did take a leap of faith that when you're going to do the right thing will happen. And I think I've been very fortunate in that it has, that people have gotten behind this. And I don't like the business part of this. Like, I don't like to solicit donations. It is how these dolls are paid for. And so since becoming a nonprofit, 100% of the dolls have come from other people. Like when you did the fundraiser. In fact, one of the dolls,
the superhero.
Yeah, it was a very high profile trans girl. And I'm actually working on one right now for a trans boy or young man. I'm working on that one next. And because I think, again, even if the doll doesn't look, there's not a limb difference or a scar, there's something incredibly validating in knowing that something was made for you that looks like you. And in the one that we did for Rebecca, I think there was something really validating in knowing what organization it came from. I think that any, and I hate, we don't like saying that there's groups of people. There are, though. And I think that when you have an opportunity to support one of your own, that's an incredible thing to do. I think it's incredibly validating. Again, we really align with empowering who you are and living out the person you're meant to be. And after doing Rebecca's doll, it was interesting because
do you want to just explain who Rebecca is?
So she is 14 or 15, a trans girl, and she and her mom have been like on the front lines of this here in the United States. Her mom's handle used to be I am that mom, and they just advocate for rights of LGBTQ kids. I mean, it's pretty amazing for such a young girl position she's in. She was actually Marvel did this group of child superheroes, and she was one of them. And that was about the time that we did this doll for her. And so she got a Marvel leather jacket, and so the doll had it had a leather jacket as well. And at that time her hair was hot pink, and so was her dolls. So are you familiar with American Girl dolls? I mean, it's the doll. It's an 18-inch doll. They initially started and they were historical, strong women. The idea concept behind it was brilliant. And the premise was it was a wholesome girl who didn't need, she didn't fall in love, none of that stuff. She was just a strong girl. And eventually she sold to Mattel. But so the 18-inch dolls, that's a pretty big deal here. In the doll world, that's a big deal. And so I made my dolls that size so that these girls could look like the cool girls, right? They want to wear the same stuff. They want to wear the costumes and the cool leather jackets. And so I think that the sizing was really important for me because they want to look the same, right? These girls are the same, girls and boys, not just girls. In fact, about a third of the dolls that I make are for boys, which I think is so interesting. I mean, talk about breaking gender stereotypes. We have this idea that girls should play with dolls, right? That boys shouldn't. And there's something so amazing in the power of a doll for some of these boys. I think that's so remarkable.
I mean, all the action figures that you get for boys, there's never like a black or an Indian or an Asian doll. It's like you're white or you're a lizard.
Yes. In fact, I've never seen an Indian male doll. That's, yeah. And in fact, so I've done a few dolls that are for little boys who are Chinese with albinism. And I remember this one, it was for a little boy who was raised in an orphanage and had not seen himself in a mirror. And so he thought, because his caretakers had dark hair and dark eyes. He thought he did as well. And they got the doll for him to introduce him to, this is what you look like. And it was, I mean, like, it was so, this should be like an experiment, because it was so fascinating. And he wouldn't recognize himself in a mirror, you know, and he was like, that's not me. I have black hair. And you talk about like the importance of seeing yourself in the face of something human. It actually led to, you know, the doll would participate in dinner. And when he loved and cared for the doll, it was actually an enormous transition in how he saw himself. I mean, it was wild. Like, I've never heard of something like that.
That's the thing, play,
Yeah.
we kind of look down on it as adults as this kind of like childlike, trivial thing. But play is such an essential thing to psychological well-being, to attachment, sense of self. It's a really, really important psychological tool. It's not just a kid playing.
Well, Sophia, you said, when have we lost kind of our moral compass? Like, when did people stop being so empathetic? And I think that there's got to be a parallel between when we stopped valuing play and when people have kind of lost this empathy, because I think you gain so much from play.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because especially if, I mean, I was an only child. I didn't get my wonderful brother till I was 13 years old. So if I was sat there playing with my dolls, I was both sides of the conversation. So I had to make a choice of how one side of me was going to treat the other side of me. Like, were they going to have a lovely time today? And were they going to go to the beach or whatever the dolls are doing? Or were they going to be arguing with each other about the cleaning and slating each other's outfits, or like arguing over the Ken doll that's not doing anything and sat in the corner? Like, you're almost teaching yourself what it's like to put yourself in other people's shoes when you're playing with these. I mean, I was Polly Pockets and Barbies, and you create all these little worlds and all these scenarios, but you're every character. So,
well, think of that little guy that I told you about, who said, they had the doll with the 10 fingers, said to the one, and he said, I like your hands, guy. I mean, you talk about you're playing both sides. You're so right. And we have to give kids that opportunity. And they're not learning those things, you know, the values of that stuff in school, right? We are heavily academic. And somewhere along the way, we've decided that these traits of empathy and kindness and understanding, and that has kind of taken a back seat.
Break times, recesses, lunch times, they're so short, and really they're a time for the kids to burn off as much energy as possible in a small amount of time, so that they can concentrate again at a high level after a short space of time, and to eat something. And it isn't really about them really interacting. And a lot of times at school they're told, be quiet, put your hand up if you want to speak. Like, there's not as much sort of a lot of group work when they're much younger. It's more about teaching them how to behave and what manners to have. At least it was at my school anyway. I mean,
you're teaching capitalism.
Sure.
It's true.
It's like how to be a profitable cell, which is why play isn't valued, because play isn't monetized in the same way that kind of becoming a scientist does, or become that. Like, societies that don't have such a rigid idea of capitalism, not to bang on my big socialist drum, play is more valued and is encouraged.
Because this is really a circular conversation. We're talking about the same things over and over. We're talking about, you know, how do you promote things like inclusion and representation?
Every single conference or panel or interview that we seem to speak on, or the crux of everything comes back to, how do we educate younger people to try and eradicate this problem as things get older? And at the moment, we're constantly chasing our tail, because there isn't quite enough being done to educate and support all of these children. So then everyone's still sort of growing up feeling slightly lonely in society, othered in some way, underrepresented. And then if they feel, you know, less empathy and negative, then in order for them to feel included, those who don't address certain things are only going to pass on their hurt and other someone else a little bit more than they feel othered, so that, okay, well, we're over here and you're over there. Thank goodness that's not me over there. So the cycle goes on.
Totally.
So that's positive.
Man, we're like totally depressing conversation now.
Sorry.
It's psychology of that need to be in an in-group. Therefore, there must be people in the out-group. So I need to form a new group, which includes me, but excludes someone else to be part of a group. On a micro level at school, people, whenever there's a friend group, there was always someone that was out the friend group that week, but was in the next month. And it was like on this weird kind of rotation. The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. Jane Elliott, don't know if you can remember on Oprah, where Hugh arbitrarily tells that people with blue eyes have certain traits, and people in the have brown eyes, and the research backs this up, and brown-eyed people are superior, and blue-eyed people are just a bit stupid. From sowing that little seed of discontent, half the audience reacts in a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy way. Like, because Oprah's like, have you ever noticed that blue-eyed people are a bit stupid? And the brown-eyed people are like, yeah, no, totally. I have this blue-eyed friend that's so dumb. In the space of maybe 10 minutes on a TV show, her telling somebody that this one group was more superior than the other group created that. So if you've gone through generations of them telling that people with limb differences are evil, then people will believe that. If you tell that men are more important than women, then our society will reflect that. If you tell that gay people are dirty, then society will reflect that. That's learned natural behaviors. It's not nature.
There's something to empowering people in you're fine just the way you are. And not only that, we think it's great,
Amy, I'd love to ask you about like the future of A Doll Like Me. Obviously, I'm sure you plan to continue making these beautiful dolls and helping these families. But is there any like milestones in your head as part of this advocacy? Is there anything that you're like, I mean, you've already got an Oprah's magazine, so that's like a big peak. But is there anything that you have a burning passion to achieve on the advocacy side?
Good question. I think that the places where these dolls have appeared in the last year or so are really unusual. There's actually a toy fair worldwide, and that's where they decide what the hot ticket will be. And they actually did a story on the dolls, and I thought that was a bold move on their part.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms of advocacy, I mean, this has reached areas like the Business Insider, or like there was an art magazine that did a piece a couple months ago. The places these dolls are appearing is really interesting. And so I guess the story, like I had said in the beginning, the story is less about me doing them and more about why this matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been the transition. A year ago, I wouldn't have anticipated that would have been the new narrative. But I think that's where A Doll Like Me has moved a bit. I mean, all I really want to do is sit at my table and make dolls.
Yeah.
Like that's all I want to do. It just, some of these other things are just really out of my comfort zone. I mean, I love talking about them because I think that there is a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad in fact, we did this interview a couple of years ago where I actually stopped the interview and I was like, I just have to ask you, could we shift the story a bit to the bigger picture? And she's like, yeah, but the story is you. And I was like, I'm really uncomfortable with that. I really want the story to be about these kids. And I want people to look at this, this video, This Morning of Hope, and say, okay, without a doubt, this matters to kids. And so, I'm very uncomfortable with the story being about me. And I like that direction. I hope that momentum continues. But all I want to do is sit down there, and that's where the selfish side, I get a lot out of sewing. Like for you, it's probably your happy place is listening to music or dancing. Mine is sitting at that sewing machine because it doesn't feel like work. So I hope that doesn't change. Obviously, there's a practical side to this, and the practical side is I have to be able to sustain a business. And I hate that. And I hate saying a business. In fact, I don't know that I've said it maybe I have once or twice, but I really don't like calling it a business because it's not a hand over fist. My kids will not go to college on this money, put it that way. I know it's a business because I pay taxes, I file paperwork, all of that stuff. But I just want to do this one kid at a time. I really just want to make a difference for the Rebeccas and the Keegans. And, I that's what I really want to do. So I hope that doesn't change. There's a pressure that there is more potential to this. And I'm so careful about who I let on the inside that I'm not sure how that will look. Will I be a Mattel manufacturing? No. But would I like to have a hand in what Mattel does next? Absolutely.
You've got the best qualitative study of anything like this that's ever been done. So you are the only person who understands the core parts of each of these dolls and these families' journeys that has really made a difference. And nobody else has that information. And as you say, I know what you mean to be in there with the manufacturing and stuff, but if you could be in there consulting, even just to build their empathy awareness around certain issues, if nothing else, I think that would be such a huge step forward for the toy industry and for so many families out there.
I would love that. I mean, the irony is I've never been paid a dime for any of the interviews that I've done, not in People magazine, not in Costco magazine. I've never received anything. And I feel like I've got such valuable information on behalf of these kids who want you to know this. Truly, like, it's for free. I'll just tell you, it's for free. You just ask me,
That to me is like the thing that you do every time that you're in one of these big magazines. And I know because you've done it with me personally, you've made me think about those kids and of what beauty is and all these different standards and what normal is, again, in inverted commas. You're battling with all these different messages that you got fed to as a child. Your messages that you're sending out there are so much healthier because it's not just about the limb difference, it's about just people being different in general. That's the overarching message. I think it's really powerful.
Amy, it's been an honour and a pleasure to speak to you for the last couple of hours. Thank you so much for your time. And we really look forward to finding other ways we can support a doll like me in the future. And just thank you for doing what you're doing. It's beautiful, beautiful work.
Thank you. This has been a great, I just looked and I realized it was 2 hours. This has been great. I feel like I already knew you guys, but I'm just so happy that we are so similar. That we're doing such similar things in very different spheres. I just love that. So keep doing what you're doing too. I appreciate that.
You are lovely. I'm looking forward to the Hallmark film of your life to come out one day. But Amy, we love you lots. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, there it is. The first episode of our brand new podcast, and what an inspiring person to dedicate it to. We hope you loved hearing Amy's story as much as we did. If anyone can spare the price of a cup of coffee to support Amy's noble work, then please do follow the link in the show notes or make a doll like me your next online birthday fundraiser or charity support. It's not cheap to make and mail these dolls worldwide to families in need, so massively appreciating anyone's support here. We have so many more exciting guests and topics coming for you on the HE.SHE.THEY podcast, and we cannot wait to share. Please follow us to make sure you don't miss an episode, and to help other people find out about HE.SHE.THEY, please review us, give a star rating, share, or whatever joy-spreading mechanism your streaming platform or social media offers. It means the world to us. Thank you. We'll be back very soon.